In the rich religious discourse and philosophical inquiry, few figures loom as large or as enigmatic as Jesus Christ. Central to Christian theology, his teachings have been interpreted, debated, and often distorted through the centuries. At the heart of this discourse lies a metaphor as ancient as it is profound, the comparison of Christ to a shepherd and his followers to sheep. This imagery, found throughout the Bible, speaks to themes of guidance, protection, and submission. Yet, beneath the surface of this metaphor lies a deeper, more nuanced dialogue about the nature of authority, power, and human frailty. For while Christ is portrayed as the ultimate shepherd, his teachings emphasize humility, compassion, and service. Qualities often at odds with the world's notions of strength and dominance. In this dichotomy, we find the crux of the debate, the tension between the idealized image of Christ as a submissive, sacrificial lamb, and the reality of Christ as a revolutionary teacher challenging the status quo. The gulf between these two interpretations is where the theatrics unfold. On one side, there are those who see in Christ's teachings a call to meekness and obedience, a willingness to lay down one's own desires and ambitions in favor of a higher purpose. This perspective emphasizes the transformative power of love and forgiveness, urging believers to emulate Christ's example of selflessness and service. Yet, on the other side, there are voices that argue for a more subversive reading of Christ's message. They point to his radical critiques of authority and injustice, his condemnation of hypocrisy and greed, as evidence of a deeper challenge to the prevailing power structures of his time, and by extension, our own. From this perspective, Christ is not merely a docile lamb led to slaughter, but a fearless advocate for truth and justice, willing to confront the powers that be at any cost. It is within this tension that we encounter the darker side of human nature, the propensity to twist and distort even the noblest of ideals for personal gain. For just as Christ warned of false prophets and hypocrites, who would lead astray the faithful, so too do we see throughout history the manipulation of his teachings for selfish ends. Whether through selective interpretation, deliberate misrepresentation, or outright exploitation, the story of Christ has been co-opted by individuals and institutions, seeking to justify their own agendas, be it the pursuit of wealth, power, or pleasure. In this light, the parables of Christ take on new significance, serving as cautionary tales against the dangers of moral relativism and spiritual complacency. For, if we are to truly follow in the footsteps of Christ, we must be vigilant against the temptation to pervert his teachings for our own ends. We must strive, instead, to embody the values of compassion, justice, and humility that he espoused, not as passive sheep blindly following the shepherd, but as conscious, compassionate beings, capable of discerning truth from falsehood, and light from darkness. Welcome to this journey on discovering a new Christ. Work by Wallace D. Wattles. A short overview of the portions of the whole video. Now remember that Jesus taught and spoke in the Aramaic, a dialect which had entirely supplanted the Hebrew among the Jews of Palestine. And that his sayings, in that language, were held in memory about 70 years before they appeared in the Greek written in the manuscripts of the Gospels, and that, from the Greek, they were translated into the English of 500 years ago in our King James Version. 500 years ago, many words in our language carried meanings which are lost now. And so you will see how foolish it is to pin so much faith on single detached sayings and passages, which may not at all convey the meaning he gave to them. In other parts, that men, and those who think and speak as he does, are the real murderers of all who die in mine, and mill, and under rolling wheels. They make the slaughter possible by cheapening the estimate that is put on the value of a human life. But when I stand in a schoolroom and look into the bright faces of 100 boys and girls, when I stand in the crowded marketplace, or in a mill or factory where my brothers and sisters toil to supply the needs of the world, and I remember that every soul before me contains possibilities as boundless as the universe itself. Chapter 1. His personality. This series will not be an attempt to prove something about Christ. It will be an effort to ascertain by scientific study what he was, how he lived, and what he taught. Too many people have studied Jesus from the standpoint of some preconceived notion of him or his mission. Such an attitude always leads to erroneous conclusions. The common concept of Christ was given to the church by the priests of the Dark Ages, at a time when a religious ideal was wanted, which should induce men to be content with slavery, and to bow their necks to every kind of wrong and oppression. And this concept was drawn almost wholly from the poetry of Isaiah. The Christ of the churches is the Christ of Isaiah. And our ideas of him are not drawn at all from an impartial study of the history of his life. Such passages in the prophecies as, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth, have been quoted to show his character, and the meekness and humbly submissive spirit with which he endured wrong and injustice, and we have had held up as the ideal man, a despised, friendless, poverty-stricken laborer, whom the upper classes regarded with scorn. Because of his lowly origin and station, who had no friends, save fishermen, laborers, outcasts, and sinners, who was often shirtless and hungry, and who bore insults and persecutions with meek submission, and walked about in a scornful world, with his hands always uplifted in loving benediction. This character has too long been offered as the Christian ideal. Be meek, be submissive, be lamb-like or sheep-like. Bow your head before the persecutor, and offer your back to the shearer. Rejoice when you are fleeced, it is for the glory of God. It is a good religion for the men with the shears. The Christ who was held up in the old-fashioned Orthodox pulpit is a weak character. He is not the kind of a man we would nominate for president, and his followers have very little faith in him as an organizer. No railroad magnate of today would make him foreman of a section. And, if it were broadcast over the country tonight, that the President of the United States had resigned, and that Jesus would be inaugurated tomorrow, 95% of the Christians there would draw their money out of the banks, for fear Jesus might start a panic. What we propose to do now is to ascertain by a study of the four Gospels, in the light of history, whether this is the real Christ. And if not, to find what the real Christ was like. The real Jesus Christ. In the first place, then, Jesus could not have been despised because he was a carpenter, or the reputed son of a carpenter. Custom required every Jewish rabbi or teacher to have a trade. We read in the Talmud of Rabbi Johanan, the blacksmith, and of Rabbi Isaac, the shoemaker, learned and highly honored men. Rabbi Jesus, the carpenter, would be spoken of in the same way. St. Paul, a very learned man, was a tent maker by trade. At that time, and among that people, Jesus could not have been despised for his birth and station. And he was popularly supposed to be of royal blood, being saluted as the son of David. His lineage was well known. The people who cried, "Hosanna to the Son of David," knew that he was an aristocrat of the aristocrats. A prince of the royal house. He was not lowly in birth, nor was he supposed to be so. On this point, I refer you to Matthew 9 verse 27, Matthew 15 verse 22, Matthew 20 verse 30, Matthew 21 verse 9, Mark 10 verse 47. He was educated. Second, he could not have been despised for his ignorance, for he was a very learned man. Whenever he went into a synagogue, he was selected to read the law and teach the congregation, as the one best qualified for that work. Luke says, there went a fame of him through all the region round about, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. In those times of fierce religious disputation, no unlearned man could have held his own in such fashion. He must have been letter perfect in the books of the Jewish law. For he was always able to rout his adversaries by making apt quotations from their own books. Even his enemies always addressed him as master or teacher, acknowledging his profound learning. On this point, read Matthew 13 verse 54, Mark 12 verses 24 to 34. Luke 4 verses 14 to 15, John 7 verses 19 to 23, John 10 verse 34. Jesus had plenty. Third, he was not despised for his poverty, for he had many wealthy and influential friends, and knew no lack of anything. Lazarus and his sisters, whose home was always open to him, were people of consequence. 4. We are told that many of the Jews came to comfort the sisters when Lazarus died. Luke says that Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the king's steward, and other women ministered unto him of their substance. That is, they were supporters of his work. The king's steward was a high official, and his wife would be a prominent lady. Joseph of Arimathea, who came to get the body of Jesus, was a well-to-do man. So, probably was Nicodemus. Jesus healed the sick in the families of rulers and high officials, and they appear to have responded liberally in supplying his financial needs. True, he held no property and bought Northwest real estate. But he dressed expensively, lived well, and never lacked for money. When he was crucified, the soldiers cast lots for his clothing because it was too fine to cut up, as they would have done with the garments of an ordinary man. And, on the night of his betrayal, when Judas went out, it was supposed by the others that he had gone to give something to the poor. It must have been their custom to give away money, or how could such a supposition have arisen? In that country and climate, the wants of Jesus and his disciples were few and simple. And they seemed to have been fully supplied. He wore fine clothes, had plenty to eat and drink, and had money to give away. Read Luke 8 verses 1 to 3, Luke 5 verse 33, Luke 23 verse 50, John 11 verse 19, John 12 verse 2, John 19 verse 23. Jesus was not humble. Fourth, Jesus was not humble in the commonly accepted meaning of the word. He was a man of the most impressive, commanding, and powerful personal appearance. He spoke as one having authority, and his word was with power. Frequently, we are told, great fear and awe fell upon the people at his mighty words and works. In one place, they were so frightened that they besought him to leave. And John tells how certain officers sent to arrest him in the marketplace lost their nerve in his commanding presence and went back, saying, "Surely, never man spake like this man." On the night of his arrest, a band of soldiers approached him in the grove and asked for Jesus of Nazareth. And when he answered, "I am he," such was his majesty and psychic power that they prostrated themselves. They went backward, the account says, and fell to the ground, John 18 verse 6. To be like the Christ of the four Gospels, one must be learned, well-dressed, well-supplied with money, and of noble and commanding appearance, speaking with authority, and having tremendous magnetic power. And now, what was his attitude toward his fellow men? Chapter 2. His attitude. One of the very best ways to reach an understanding of Jesus is by studying his reasons for taking the title he assumed, the Son of Man. He rarely spoke of himself in any other way. This term, Son of Man, was common in the Jewish prophecies and in the current conversation of the times, and it was simply an emphatic way of saying, man. If you wish to emphasize your fealty to democracy, you might say, "I am a son of Thomas Jefferson," and if you wish to emphasize your fealty to humanity, you would say as Jesus did, "I am a son of man." The world Jesus lived in. The Roman Empire was a great taxing machine. In its conquered provinces, the people were left, as far as possible, with their own local government and institutions of justice. The function of the Roman officials being to extort tribute or collect taxes. Every form of extortion and oppression was practiced by the governors, procurators, and tax collectors upon those who had property. Open robbery, torture, kidnapping, false accusation, and imprisonment might be visited upon the men who had money to tempt the cupidity of the higher powers. And, as the oppressed property owners had no way of meeting the exactions of the government but by exploiting the poor, the condition of the masses was pitiful indeed. You will readily see that the business and property-owning class had to get the money to pay their taxes by exploiting the multitude in some way. It is an economic axiom which is indisputable that all taxation of whatever kind, upon whomsoever levied, must at last be wrung from the hard hands of the producers. No one, however, seems to comprehend this fact, as little as the producers themselves. They strenuously reject all offers of deliverance, and generally kill those who try to help them. Jesus received his only real and permanent following from among the middle class, as we shall see, and was crucified by the workers, whom he was trying to deliver from oppression. It was no middle-class mob which demanded the liberation of Barabbas and howled for the blood of Christ. To give you an idea as to how oppressive the Roman taxation was, we may estimate from certain passages in Josephus that the private income of Herod the Great was $3.5 million a year. That is vastly less, of course, than the income of our John D. Rockefeller. But our Herods have a much larger, richer, and more populous country to levy taxes on. And they have discovered methods of extortion which laid the crude ways of the monarchs of antiquity very far in the shade. The enormous sums, which were collected from the little province of Galilee, brought the unhappy workers down to the last extremity of destitution. They could go no lower and live. The sects of Jesus' day. In Judea at this time were several religious sects, which were also, in a way, political parties, scheming for prestige and power, and for influence with Rome. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Samaritans, etc., disagreed upon various questions, as the existence or non-existence of angels, the resurrection of the dead, baptism, and so on. The strife between these parties was desperately acrimonious and bitter, often to the point of open violence. You will notice as you read that they were always ready to take up stones to end a dispute. Riots were of daily occurrence in the streets of Jerusalem, and only the psychic power and commanding personality of Jesus saved him from being stoned by these religious mobs. Read Luke 4 verse 28 to 30, Luke 20 verse 6, John 8 verse 59. The leaders of these sects were, of course, of the middle or property-owning class. But the rank and file were the common masses, sunk in the most abject poverty, taxed, beaten, robbed, outraged, slaughtered, with no voice lifted anywhere in their behalf. No one, Jew or Gentile, thought for a moment of demanding justice for the mongrel multitude. It is said of Jesus that he had compassion on the multitude, because they fainted, and were amazed, and were like sheep without a shepherd, Matthew 9 verse 36. They had then, as now, plenty of shepherds to baptize them, to interpret prophecy for them, to instruct them in spiritual things. But none to demand a lightening of their burdens, none to cry out, in their behalf, for justice. The principal care of the shepherds was that the flock should be so doctrinally correct that they would never consent to be sheared by the opposing party. The new thought of Jesus' time. Into this maze of oppression, taxation, murder, outrage, and theological discussion comes the grand, strong figure of this young prince and scholar, saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor. I am no Pharisee, I am no Sadducee, Essene, or Samaritan, I am a man. I come, not in behalf of Pharisaism or Samaritanism, but in behalf of humanity." Here was an altogether different religious attitude. He had no ism to build up. His only creed was justice. His only doctrine the square deal. No wonder they were amazed at his doctrine. No wonder his word was with power. No wonder they said, "He speaketh as one having authority." Jesus said of himself that the Father had given him authority to execute judgment, because he was man, John 5 verse 27. That is the only reason God could possibly have for giving authority to any man. If there is a man anywhere today, upon whom the divine sanction rests, it is not because he is a Pharisee, a Methodist, Presbyterian, Republican, or Democrat, but because he is a man. And it is further true that, amongst all those who claim leadership by virtue of divine authority, we may apply this test with certainty, that the man who stands for humanity, first, last and all the time, against all vested interests, religious and economic, is the man who stands as Jesus stood. The man who stands for humanity, against the vested religious interests of his time, frequently is called an infidel. And the man who stands for the propertyless, against the vested political and economic interests of his time, is called a traitor. Jesus was crucified on the charges of infidelity and treason. And he was guilty on both counts. Let no one be too horrified here to proceed further. For there are no prouder titles, when justly held, than the terms infidel and traitor. It was a grand saying of Wendell Phillips, "Write upon my grave. Infidel traitor, infidel to every church that compromises with wrong. Traitor to every government that oppresses the poor." The most sinful infidelity is not being unfaithful to some church, but being unfaithful to the truth, and the vilest treason is not turning against some government, but turning against the weak and helpless. This was the attitude which Jesus took. He gave expression to all this when he took the title which made him the champion of humanity. When he said, "I am the Son of Man." We will now take up the consideration of his teachings. Chapter 3. His teachings about men. If Jesus was a savior, he came to save mankind, collectively and individually, from sin, from error. For there is nothing but error to be saved from. That is what he says of himself, in John 18 verse 37, "To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." A lost world is a world which has lost the truth about life. And a lost man or woman is simply one who has lost the truth about life. And there is no other way under heaven to save the lost but by telling them the truth about life. This simple sentence, in which he concisely states his mission, lets in a flood of light upon his theory of life. He came to save from sin, disease, and poverty by telling the truth. Then sin, disease, and poverty are untruths. That is, they are wrong ways of living. We will consider first his broader and more generic application of truth, and later his application of it to the individual. In the Sermon on the Mount, he says, Matthew 5 verses 21 to 22, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother Raca shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say thou fool shall be in danger of hell fire." The phrase, "thou fool," as we understand it now, does not give the meaning of the original at all. It would be better rendered by some such phrase as, "You are of no value," or "You are good for nothing." I can make his meaning clear, I think, by an illustration. I was sitting in a hotel lobby once when the news came of a coal mine horror in which a number of poor fellows lost their lives. Two well-dressed men near me were discussing the affair, and one said, "Oh, well, it's only a couple of Huniacs less. 1,000,000 more are ready to step into their shoes tomorrow. The world hasn't lost anything." Jesus says, "Whosoever shall speak of a man as that man spoke, is in danger of hellfire." That man, and those who think and speak as he does, are the real murderers of all who die in mine, and mill, and under rolling wheels. They make the slaughter possible by cheapening the estimate that is put on the value of a human life. Whosoever talks of cheap people and of lower classes, and insists that some are especially valuable to God, and that others are their inferiors, will go to hell, said Jesus. And I think he was right. A little farther on in his life, we shall see how he proved it, and on what great natural fact he based his assertion. I have given you the exact meaning of the quoted passage, and the only meaning which may legitimately be drawn from it. Turn now to the 12th chapter of Matthew, and read the first 8 verses. The Sabbath. There, you find that the disciples were crossing the fields on the Sabbath day, and that they plucked the ears of corn, and ate as they went. This gave great offense to the Pharisees. They were not offended because they took the grain, for, under the Jewish law, the right of the hungry wayfarer to life transcended the property rights of the owner of the field. None might say the famished man nay, if he chose to pluck and eat. It was not to a theft of grain that the Pharisees objected, but to the fact that the plucking and eating were done on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees believed that the one thing most valuable to God was their church with its institutions and observances. They would not break the Sabbath to feed a hungry man or to heal a sick man, because they thought the Sabbath was more valuable to God than the man. And so they complained to Jesus, and he answered them, "Have ye not heard what David did when he was hungry, he and they that were with him?" And he went on to tell them from their own scriptures, in which, as I have said, he was letter perfect, how David and his followers went into the temple, and took the sacred shewbread and ate it, and God approved. One standeth here, said Jesus, greater than the temple. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath day. That is, God cares more for a hungry man than he does for a holy day or house. In the 2nd chapter of Mark, where the same story is told, he adds, the Sabbath was made for men, and not men for the Sabbath. Organizations. Here is brought out and sharply defined the issue between Jesus and his opponents. They were exalting the temple, the worship, the Sabbath, the ceremonial. He exalted the men. They declared that God was working through humanity to build systems and institutions. He declared that God was working through systems and institutions to build humanity. And I, for one, agree with Jesus. I feel no reverence for buildings, even though they are magnificent structures, where the dim light falls through stained glass windows, upon the sculptured forms of saints and angels, where robed priests chant in solemn cadence. These things move me little. But when I stand in a schoolroom, and look into the bright faces of 100 boys and girls, when I stand in the crowded marketplace, or in a mill or factory, where my brothers and sisters toil to supply the needs of the world, and I remember that every soul before me contains possibilities as boundless as the universe itself. When I stand in the presence of this toiling, seeking, loving, suffering, glorious, common humanity, I bare my head and bow in reverence, for here, indeed, I am in the presence of Almighty God. One is here, greater than the temple, greater than the Sabbath, greater than the system, greater than the institution, greater than the church or state. God has a higher call for men than the keeping of certain days and places holy. This whole earth is a holy place, because it is consecrated by the love of God to fulfill his purpose in unfolding the high destiny of men. Little children. In the 18th chapter of Matthew, you will read how Jesus took a little child, and set him in the midst of them, and said, "Whosoever shall humble himself as this little child, the same shall be greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And he went on to assert that whatsoever should offend the child had better be cast into the sea. You will get a good idea of the prevailing misconception concerning Jesus and his times if you study the pictures you commonly see of the scene where he blessed the little children. He is always shown to us surrounded by prettily dressed women who are bringing nice clean babies for him to love and bless. And it looks very easy for one to humble himself as one of those. But turn back to our description of the condition of the masses in his day, and you will get a different idea. That was a slave child that he set in the midst of them, unwashed, uncombed, covered with vermin, and noisome sores repulsive to every sense. A child of the abyss. In the darkest period of the world's history, And what could he mean by telling us to humble ourselves as such a child? Is it that we should be childlike in spirit, teachable, credulous? No, there is only one way. Stand beside the child of the gutter and say, before God, he is as good as I. He is entitled to everything that I claim for myself and for my children, and I will not rest until all that I demand for my own is his also. Then you will have humbled yourself as the little child by acknowledging his equality with you. And then you will begin to be great in the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever shall offend one of these little slaves ones, it is better that a millstone shall be hanged about his neck, and he were cast into the sea. Yes, any man or woman or railroad system or financial system or industrial order or disorder that stands between the poor man's child and life is under the curse of God. It is better that all the corn crops of 1,000 years be lost than that the least injustice shall be done to one such little child. That is what Jesus taught, and it is not to be wondered at that he was crucified.